Tribeca X, behind the mic, the business of building audio empires.
Yeah, we're here to talk about sort of building brand empires in audio and podcasting. So, first off, like Gary, Rachel, what basically drove you to realize that podcasting was the thing, and what made you start your businesses? Gary, I'll start with you.
Sure. So after spending a total of 20 years at both the agency and the brand side, certainly realized that podcasting was emerging as a new viable medium, and also on my end realizing that brands needed access to diverse audiences, will need access to diverse audiences within the podcast ecosystem. And then I was looking for one of my advertisers at the time when I was on the agency side was looking to reach African American women and Afro-Latinas. And I reached out to all of the various networks, whether it was iHeart, Spotify, reached out to all of them, and no one really had shows that catered to that audience. So that's when I realized that there was a gap in the marketplace as far as how do Fortune 500 brands reach diverse audiences that have a $5.1 trillion buying power. That's very sort of that consume quality content that looks to host and trusted voices that they recognize. So that's what led me to launching Positive Media as the first and the largest multicultural podcast network in the country in 2018.
That's awesome. Rachel, what about you?
Mine was a little less savvy and a little more selfish. I just really loved podcasts. But my whole career had been helping brands figure out how to tell their story in a way that people were actually going to care about. So I started my career helping brands figure out social media back when social media was new. Don't date me. And I've been doing that like all the way through. So I did PR and communications for early stage startups, helping them like tell their story to the world right when they were launching. And when podcasts sort of started taking off with mainstream and not just with my nerd friends, I was like, oh, brands are gonna need to figure this out too, because it's such a sticky channel. Like if someone is a diehard podcast listener, they will do almost anything the host tells them to do. So I just thought this is going to be a really smart channel for brands if they can figure it out. So that was 10 years ago. Yeah.
Having been on the agency side, I can definitely say that
Yeah.
they do everything the hosts tell them to
Yeah,
do.
they do. It's
Getting
terrifying.
back to like how you work with brands. Gary, you mentioned that you didn't find content that works for them. Are both of you working with brands sort of through existing shows? Do you see brands creating their own shows? Like, how does that work in your area?
Yeah, on our end, brands come to us because we have the reach and scale in terms of, hey, if they're looking to reach African American women between the age of 18 to 35, we can actually go and reach that audience at scale. So what we'll typically do is when we get an RFP, we'll come back to them with an a la carte menu of all the shows that's applicable for them to reach that audience. On our end, I still 8 years later, I'm still very anti-programmatic in podcasting because I think the true power of podcasting is really the ability for the host to tell stories and for them to personalize, to say, hey, last night I was out, watching the Knicks highlights and I was drinking a Budweiser, and before you know it, those personal stories that's like seamlessly integrated as part of the content, I think is a true sort of really what makes podcasting truly special.
But you had to create shows, right? Like for these brands, right? Just to clarify.
We've created shows for brands, but on our end, we call ourselves an agency network because podcasters come to us, or we find podcasters that look at us as an agency because we're brokering deals on their behalf, right? Because we have the relationships with the brand partners where we can say, hey, McDonald's is a client, WPP is a client, Omnicom, those large agencies are clients. We can certainly broker deals on your behalf. However, on the brand side and the agency side, they look at us as a network because we're a centralized location where they can reach those diverse audiences at scale.
Now that makes sense. What about you, Rachel?
Yeah, so we're usually working with a brand from the moment that they said, maybe we should have a podcast, but we have no idea how to do it, or we've tried to do it and it didn't work because we didn't know what we were doing. And we really approach it where we're trying to figure out how to build a new content flywheel for our clients. So it's usually an ongoing show or a seasonal show that's going to be like consistently creating premium content that fills up, their most important channels, but specifically speaking to their most diehard or target audience for the long form, and then the short form we're thinking about as more of like a top of funnel strategy, where that's bringing people into the brand, catching their interest, pulling, getting your hooks in, pulling them down the rabbit hole, hopefully. So it all should work together, and so usually with brands, they'll come to us and be like, we might have a kernel of an idea, or we have someone that we think would be a good host, and we know that we should be playing in this world, we just don't know what it should be. So we'll go through a development workshop and pitch them a bunch of ideas that we think would strike, the balance of who do you want to reach, what do you want them to take away from this. Alternatively, sometimes it's a limited series where the goal is to have a huge splash, like the 2 docu-series that we've got up nominated tomorrow. That's more of like a PR move, an award, hopefully award-winning move, we'll see. So, those are 2 different strategies, but we love, if we're not coming in at the moment of conception, then we oftentimes will pass on it.
So would you say that the economics of podcasting have shifted from where they've been, and if so, like, how has that changed?
So be more specific when you say
Well,
economics.
like, for instance, like, in the past, us at Crooked, right, we do a lot of advertising internally, mainly it's the hosts of our shows endorsing products.
Yeah.
We've done a couple of limited series, but to your perspective, do you see more brands coming in and making these limited series on your end?
Not more of the limited series. We probably only do a couple of those per year because they are, like, it's a PR play, it's a big moment play, and so it'll be part of usually a huge campaign that they have going, or, a big anniversary, or, Aura Ring's got a huge feature coming out, something like that. More often we are creating now an ongoing podcast that has audio and video so that it can live on all of their channels and be a consistent touch point with the audience.
That makes sense. What about the economics of what you're starting to see? Are brands coming in at the capacity much more so? Are they more familiarized with, the shows you're doing? And are they looking at podcasts from a perspective of, this is something I have to have in my media mix? While in the past, maybe they were a little bit hesitant?
Yeah, in the past we were certainly hesitant. Again, on our end, when we came in late 2017, early 2018, podcasting at the time was $240 million revenue a year type business, right? And in this year we're projected to be at potentially $5 billion, right? So that shows you sort of in terms of the gap from 8 years ago. So back then, no one knew some CMOs did not even know what a podcast was, right? So not only now we have to go and say, hey, you should be advertising a podcast, and then on top of that, we're saying, hey, we're targeting multicultural audiences, African Americans, Hispanics, LGBTQ+. We can help you reach those audiences at scale. So the hesitant was like, it was extremely hard for us to get budgets. But I think now what's happening is that the medium is much more robust. The measurement is much more robust. The type of talent that's coming on board, for example, you have the Oprahs of the world, the Stephen A. Smiths of the world, like recognizable figures that's like nationally known and now creating podcast content. That has certainly sort of validated the medium so that it makes it easier to have those conversations because everyone is quite familiar. And of course, now enters the Netflixes of the world, the fact that video is playing such a vital role in podcasting. So
Stole my next question.
so it's a much easier conversation. But I think for me, what I'm very much excited about is certainly within the next few years is podcasting leveling up to the level of TV, display advertising, video advertising, so we can sort of really capture those larger budgets.
So like, when you're talking to your clients, like there's a massive difference between running a traditional ad on a show like Pod Save America or one of your shows, right? Or telling brand storytelling like what you're doing. Like, how are you approaching these conversations with the brands and the agencies to kind of ensure that they're familiar and, are they at a point where they know that this is something that needs to be done on the past?
Yeah, I would certainly say that for sure. They're certainly at a point where they understand that podcasting needs to be part of the media mix. However, which platform, which network, which audiences, different clients have different goals, have different objectives. On our end, our job just becomes harder because we have to sell through the diverse audiences. And certainly in this current climate where, DEI and diverse audiences, all of those things, that was quite popular a few years ago, 2020 to 2024. So our job is much harder, but they do understand that podcasting is essential simply because they know the audience, the way the audience is consuming podcast content have grown tremendously, and the data supports it. All the Nielsen reports, Triton digital reports, all the research information that we have points to that. And on our end, as part of a pitching process, we need to talk about like how podcasting is going, how the audience is going, where they're actually consuming it, and how they're consuming it.
I think a few big things happened in the last few years too that made, for us on our side, our job much easier. Like, first of all, everybody listens now. Thank God, finally. We got more watches, but we got there. That's great. So now I no longer have to explain like what a podcast is to CMOs, to your point. So that is a great start. I think also, unfortunately, the podcast election, even though it didn't go the way I wanted, it did really like show how important being a guest on podcasts are. And just like the pop culture lately, like big news now is broken on podcasts. It's not broken on late night, it's not broken in articles,
Right.
It's now broken on podcasts. Like this is where the cultural conversations are happening. This is where people are going to drop bombs, like intentionally. This is where news is breaking from the least important stuff to the most important stuff. And I think just that has shown brands that like this is where hearts and minds are being changed is on podcasts. So if we want one, also just the movement that brands need to be authentic, need to be human, we can smell bullshit. And a podcast I think really, like if you do it well, if you have good talent and people who can like embody the humanization of that brand, it will be really, really effective.
No, I agree. Sorry, Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think now also on our end, even though we do focus on making sure we are securing a lot of media dollars, we are telling brands similarly to how you can have an Instagram page, a Facebook page, a TikTok page, you should also have a podcast. That should also become part of your PR communication strategy to ensure that you can break the news, internal news, things that are happening within your podcast. And
On your own terms.
Right, exactly. So we're seeing a lot. We're doing that convincing. We're not quite there with all of them yet, but we are seeing more brands sort of really embracing it and saying, hey, we need to have our own podcast so we can control the voice, we can control the narrative. When something happens, that people are not just talking about it on Twitter and we have to defend ourselves, but we can actually tell that story through a podcast.
So like getting into the fact that when some of us started in this industry, I've been in almost 13 years, like this was mainly an audio industry, right? Now everything's video, right? How are you planning these campaigns with, the foresight, the buzzword right now is 360 campaigns, right? Social, creator, focused, in addition to these podcasts. How are you doing that for brands on either side, and either of you can jump in here?
For us, 360 is actually a word we love at Pod Media simply because we do audio, we do video, we do social, and then we add experiential into the mix as we for culturally relevant moments, i.e. Pride Month, Black Music Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, Black History Month, Super Bowl, All-Star. In our tentpole activation takes place in Miami every year during Art Basel. So on our end, we have the calendar of activations that we're doing throughout the year, but then we can still do bespoke events, i.e. the Hampton Honors or Martha's Vineyards, right? Where we actually know the audience that you're looking to reach, the affluent African American or Hispanic, families, the moments that matter to them, we play a part into that. So on our end, we're able to really sort of plan for around those events, and in addition, also know what the type of shows that we have and the type of the major moments that are coming up where we can say, hey, this is where your brand, we can integrate your brand as part of into the fold.
Yeah, for us, we added social and video years and years and years ago, and it's just because our main client is brands and the purpose is content marketing, it needs to be able to live everywhere. I personally am still a podcast listener. That's how I prefer to consume. But the way we define a podcast at this point is, can you listen to the audio only and understand the content? The video should be a nice to have as opposed to a need to have. So that anybody can consume it however they want. But the short form, like at this point, it used to be we were just clipping out the best moments in the beginning, and now it's like we are constructing, our social producer is in the development workshop, brainstorming social segments that will live within the show and bonus content that we'll capture. Like it's a whole department of our team now that lives under the podcast team or between podcast and marketing team really. So it's just like the short form is just as important as the long form for our clients specifically.
I feel like, we're at Tribeca right now. This is obviously a festival that honors independent media as well. Like, how are you both looking at branded content being sort of awarded, I know you mentioned you're up for 2 awards, right? But creating content that feels organic, that doesn't feel forced, like from a, I'd say, multicultural perspective, people can smell when it's inauthentic, right? People know when it's forced. So how are you approaching these things, both with your brands and with the content you're creating?
You know, and what we tell our brand partners is that this is not going to be an infomercial. This is going to be an infomercial of 30 to 45 minutes of just you telling the world how great, you know, your brand is. It's identifying, it's on our end identifying the right talent that makes sense for that given campaign or for that given initiative. And then when we have that, you know, once we identify the talent, and then now we're saying, look, this is the story you're going to tell. How do you let that person give the person the flexibility to tell the stories to still be themselves, and then your brand can be seamlessly injected as part of that content. So that's how we're approaching it. You know, and of course you have your logo placements, your digestible social content, etc. However, for the most part, we want to make sure that it can still be, let it be about the host and the quality of their personality, let that sort of shine through the podcast, and then let your brand sort of really be immersed into it.
That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I tell my team that like sales does not stop when the contract is signed. It's so important that when we're presenting them concepts that are adventurous and creative, that we push them to really get outside of their bounds. And we do that from the first conversation we ever have with them, but all the way through, pushing them to say, if you really want this to break through, if you really want to reach this audience and have it be a show that they want to spend time with every week, you have to push the bounds. You have to have the right talent. You have to have fun segments. You have to think about and make something truly different than what's already out there. That is also the only thing your brand could make, right? Like, why are you the right person to make this show? It has to make sense for your values, but it also has to be something that's truly additive to the conversation and differentiated and fun or educational, or, you know, it depends on the tone of the show. So that continues all the way through the development workshop and then beyond, because they do have to fight the temptation towards safety, towards,
Sure.
you know, getting our talking points in there. And I understand that. I used to be the PR person on the side of the brand, so, which I think is helpful, because I can be like, this is not going to make any noise. You will have flushed all this money down the toilet if we don't push it a little bit further.
I think for us at Cricket specifically, right, one of the things that we harp on all the time internally is how do we educate people, entertain them, because we're talking about subject matters that are really complicated, mainly news and politics, and then inspire them to take action. And, you know, some of our shows,
That part.
yeah, that's the big part, but it's also the big part for the brands, right? Like, because if they're taking action on some of the things we want them to do, whether that is volunteering, voting, persuading their neighbors, right? They're more likely to go out and make a purchase. But in our main shows, the way that we look at sort of advertising, specifically like Pod Save America, it's kind of comic relief in a way. Like, the hosts really banter amongst one another.
And those are the only ones I don't skip.
Correct. And like, as a former ad buyer doing this for 13 plus years and starting on the ad agency side, you can see what's working and what isn't. Like, obviously the space has evolved. We have video, we've got product placement. We, you know, are leaning into social slower than some of us would like, but like we're going through that path. We're doing experiential. We've got an event called Crooked Con. We had 2,500 people there last year. This year we're anticipating having about 5,000. We'll have some probably 28 presidential hopefuls there, but we're also going to have the nurse from Iowa and the school teacher from Kansas, because we want to make it approachable, right? And I think that's the key, is making content that people feel like they want to be involved in, and also that can be approachable for both the audience and the advertiser.
Yeah, there's so much content out there also too, right? So you know, when you're creating branded content, like Rachel said, you have to push the needle. Like, if you're known to be a conservative brand and you're approaching this medium and thinking we're also not saying like let's bypass all the guardrails from a brand safety perspective. We are not saying that, right? What we're saying is, once you've identified the right talent, allow them to really be themselves and give them your flexibility to push the envelope, because you also know from a new target audience perspective, or, you know, you don't even know when new consumers you might discover throughout that entire process.
Exactly. I know we're coming up a little bit on time, but I definitely want to kind of get into where each of you think this industry is heading. Like, obviously, video kind of came about 5, 6, 7 years ago. We started in 2020. But do you have any feedback or thoughts on this?
I mean, I think vertical video specifically is what everybody's talking about with good reason. I think seeing more, to your point, you're saying, I want to see podcasting level up. I think vertical video is also going to level up, and we're going to see more advanced storytelling in that medium. But also gaming, like gaming is everything, and we are like now in the process of like once we have a hit show for a client, can there be an interactive element, starting out with easy things like polls and voting and whatever, but you could take that so much further and have like a companion game that people play every week, or scoreboard for fantasy draft or what have you. And so really thinking through gaming nerds on my team. So we're really
I
going
have
on that
never
road.
heard gaming before, so like this is like a first for me. This
Yeah.
is kind of eye-opening.
I
but
think they should all play together. Like,
listen, I like that.
yeah.
What about you, Gary?
I think for me is very excited the fact that, again, the measurement piece is getting much more robust. When it comes to measurement, I'll tell you a few years ago in the junior sales presentation, there's so many new tools that's out there that allows attribution to understand when someone listens to a podcast, listen to an annual podcast, and how that's actually moving the needle and how people are actually going to go out to purchase your product or your services. So very excited about that. From a brand safety perspective, we work with a company called Barometer that allows, where we can bring information back to our clients or advertisers to say, hey, look, this is a great podcast, be a part of it. They might drop a few F-bombs here and there. However, for the most part, it doesn't sort of, it is going to pass the litmus test from a safety perspective. So I'm really excited about that because, yes, it's one thing to say we want podcasts to level up, to be at the same level as display, video, etc. But at the same time, we need to have the right tools in the back end to support that. So I'm extremely excited about that.
Please subscribe to Visible Black Woman on Patreon, Medium, and Substack.